So you're great at telling stories. You're great at explaining things. Tell the audience, where did it all start? Who was Epstein in the beginning? And how the hell did he become that wealthy guy that Wexner gave him power of attorney to his empire?
Well, no one really knows the answer to that, and we're left to speculate. But there's levels of educated speculation in this. I do think that you have this very coincidental start to his career, where he is recruited without a college degree to teach at one of the most prestigious private schools in New York City, the Dalton School, by Donald Barr, who is Bill Barr's father. Bill Barr would be the head of the Justice Department, in charge of the Epstein investigation when Epstein would die, and his father. So, you have the life of Jeffrey Epstein bookended by a CIA family running the justice system. I'm just
And Bill
let that
Barr, and one
sentence
more,
wash
just
over you.
exactly. That's just the beginning. And Bill Barr was the last person to see Epstein before he killed himself or he died.
Right. And a little bit more just on the family here. Donald Barr started his career in the CIA just like Bill Barr did. Donald Barr was one of the sort of original members of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. And then he went to Columbia, as many CIA folks did. Columbia was the sort of CIA university front of the media and education space. Columbia was highly involved with the war effort and the propaganda effort. Columbia obviously controls the Pulitzer Prize, which is administered out of Columbia University. The Columbia School of Journalism is the best school of journalism. The Columbia Journalism Review sets the standards for the international journalism industry. And so Donald Barr went from the CIA to Columbia to this elite New York City private school where he was the headmaster. No one knows why Donald Barr chose Jeffrey Epstein to be a math and physics teacher there, but for whatever reason, it effectively, between something like 19 and 21 years old, Jeffrey Epstein was a tutor, effectively a teacher and tutor to high school kids, and it was there that he met the children of Ace Greenberg, who he reportedly tutored at the Dalton School. Ace Greenberg was the head of probably the most notorious banking firm on Wall Street, Bear Stearns, which we should say rest in peace. It is now part of the large intestine of, I think, J.P. Morgan Chase. It died in the 2008 financial crisis. It was sort of the biggest casualty of that. But before that, it was known as the most aggressive, reckless, but also profitable Wall Street trading firms that effectively was willing to take bets and willing to do creative structuring that other banks did not want to pursue. They essentially chased higher up the yield curve in terms of risk. And Ace Greenberg had a philosophy at Bear Stearns that he called that he wanted people who were PSD, poor, smart, and driven. And because Ace Greenberg himself, that was sort of his rags to riches story. And from all appearances, he saw Jeffrey Epstein, who he remained lifelong friends with, as as similar to himself in various ways. And so he recruited when Epstein, I think, was fired from the Dalton School or left under not great circumstances. He didn't have a job, and Ace Greenberg recruited him to work, I think, initially as a floor trader, or essentially following people around in equities and debt. And then he moved into the family estate planning side of Bear Stearns, where the high net worth family wealth was essentially managed by the Bear Stearns folks, the investments as well as the tax structuring. So how to shelter assets in order to make them most tax efficient, which often involves very creative, elaborate, complex offshore structuring arrangements. And Epstein, by all reports, excelled at that, or at least we don't know about his technical chops. And in the many
That was
years.
my question. I was gonna ask you, like, how did he even get into bear stearns, considering his background?
Well, he appeared to be a charmer from a very early age. I mean, he was a guy who I think was in Cosmopolitan magazine in his early 20s as one of New York's most eligible bachelors, and uh, there he seemed to be a charming guy, not just with women but also with men, and that a lot of big banking and big law work. I saw this myself in New York. Is you need the technically competent people, but within the firm's power structure, actually, it's the rainmakers, it's the schmoozers, the people who are good with clients who actually make more money than the technically competent people because they're the ones who bring the money into the firm, and then that's handled by the people who are the technical whizzes. So what it appears, because Jeffrey Epstein made partner at Bear Stearns, I think in just 4.5 years or 4 years, which
That's
this is
insane.
something that normally takes something like 8 to 9 years. He moved up very quickly, and by the time he was 28 years old, he went out on his own. Now, so again, you have this Bear Stearns connection. What's very important is at that time, Bear Stearns was handling major family accounts who would later come to play a very, very significant role in geopolitics.
I think this is where he starts meeting some of the people that will raise more question marks. So just to kind of take the audience for where we started him getting into the Dalton School, which I heard it was some people say, I know it's alleged, but it was a recruitment place for intelligence. Have you heard that before? And is there any truth to that, or is that just an empty allegation?
I've not heard that. I've not, I guess, seriously investigated because the thread seemed to be kind of thin. But given that the headmaster was Donald Barr, who, again, was part of the founding group of the Central Intelligence Agency and then went to another kind of major CIA recruiting hub in Columbia University, I would not be surprised. It is worth noting that it's not uncommon for things to start that young. That is, when college is a major, major recruiting ground for that, and the elite New York City families, uh, where you have high net worth individuals, or you have folks around the United Nations, which is in New York, and their ambassador families and the like, um, and the relations between New York City commerce and kind of international politics. It would not be surprised to that part of Donald Barr's role may have been doing so. It's also worth noting that, like father, like son, Bill Barr started his career in the CIA. He worked before he became a lawyer, he started off in the CIA. He went to law school while he was at night while he was at the CIA. And then his job when he came back to the CIA with his legal degree was effectively being the legal liaison between the CIA and Congress to stop Congress from being able to get CIA documents about the Iran-Contra scandal, which, strangely, Jeffrey Epstein was involved in.
Which is insane as well. So we have Jeffrey Epstein getting into the Dalton School. Now, the people that said that it's a recruitment place for intelligence or potentially use Blumenthal is Max from Blumenthal. So Max Blumenthal from Grayzone, and I think it was Daryl Cooper and Tucker, but it wasn't confirmed. It's like an allegation. Now, there's one more thing though, and that one's confirmed that Donald Barr did write a book, and I mentioned it earlier. The dean of that school, that was ex-intelligence, that is the father of William Barr, of Bill Barr, that hired Epstein, got him into that kind of life before getting to Bear Stearns, also wrote a book that mirrors what Epstein has done in the last 20 years. Is that correct? It's like a very twisted book about a sci-fi book called Space Relations. It has a very similar story to what Epstein has done. Is that correct?
Well, I think what people latch on to with that is that part of the book involves a plot around pedophilia and kind of alien pedophiles having with secret societies effectively controlling home planet politics and the like. So there is a kind
That's
of
just weird. It doesn't point to anything. This is probably one of the weakest question marks, but it's just bizarre. So now we have
well
through
maybe it's
Dalton, he
me.
gets into.
Meme magic, maybe this wouldn't have happened. He memed it into reality. Yeah.
Um, so he got into Bear Stearns, and then that's where he starts meeting some questionable people, getting into the Iran story as
Right.
well.
Yes. Yes. So now he got to Bear Stearns in the first place because he became close with Ace Greenberg, the CEO of Bear Stearns, while he was at the Dalton School. So he already had essentially a kinship with the head of the firm, and so he was speed run up through the promotion channel, remained very close with Ace Greenberg even after he left Bear Stearns, and uh, in that family planning in estate part of Bear Stearns, he was managing, as as the evidence suggests, and many reports and public reportings are on this. But the Bronfman family estate, which is Edgar Bronfman and the Bronfman family, have played a major role in everything from intelligence to organized crime to international geopolitics for generations, really. I mean, the Bronfman family fortune goes back to the 1920s and the bootlegging um, black market industry for, at first, alcohol during the Prohibition period from 1920 to 1933, when alcohol was prohibited. The the Chicago and Cincinnati mafia folks were the primary distributors for bootlegged alcohol, which they would source from Canada, particularly the Bronfman family in Canada. They ran Seagram's gin, and the liquor conglomerates that they own. And so the Bronfman family really made its bones during that black market period. But then when Prohibition ended in 1933, those markets began to move into drugs, and all of that also runs through the unions and labor, and because you need the transportation, you need the truckers, the ports, the customs agents. You need all of these different union folks, and I only bring that up because if you remember Alex Acosta, the one who cut Jeffrey Epstein the sweetheart deal, and that reportedly explained to the Trump administration vetters when he was up for Secretary of Labor that he did so because Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence, and he was told to leave it alone because it was above his pay grade. He was up for the position of Department of Labor, which is the unions, and which is also very tightly linked to intelligence work, because that's our sort of street muscle as well as
How does the
logistics.
So does the Bronfman family? Don't tell me that links to Epstein in some way, does it?
Well, of course it does, because Epstein was managing, as part of his responsibilities in the family estate section of Bear Stearns, he was managing the Bronfman money. He was
How did he get them
help.
as a client? How did he get them as a client? How can you get one of the biggest clients imaginable so early on?
Well, that just because someone's your client doesn't mean that you're actually doing the work. For
Okay.
example, the fact that he was close with Ace Greenberg, it could have been as simple as this. He and Ace Greenberg meet with the Bronfmans. They are meeting in the New York office at Bear Stearns, and Edgar Bronfman takes a liking to, or Charles Bronfman takes a liking to Jeffrey Epstein the same way that Ace Greenberg did. They common interests, speak the same language. Epstein was always around women and throwing parties and at these things, even in his 20s. There are lots of ways that you can connect with someone as a what they call in these firms relationship manager, or the relationship partner, essentially the person who is the relationship point of contact, but is not the person who's actually doing the complex structuring charts, or working out whether it's more tax efficient to stash assets in Liechtenstein, or a Panamanian bank, or a Swiss bank account, or the Cayman Islands. I've never seen evidence that Jeffrey Epstein was technically competent at the actual work, but that he served as essentially a very smooth and likable broker who could get the work done by connecting the sort of quants and structures and asset tracers to clients, and essentially, and that's not uncommon. Again, I worked for 8 years as a New York City corporate lawyer, and that's ordinary. That's the typical structure. Clients don't want to work with when you have high profile business clients who own yachts and fly around on private planes, and their time is short and they live life to the maximum. They don't want to be spending their hours talking with a boring accountant who doesn't understand their language. And so
He must be either extremely charming, um, because it's still very early, and these are pretty big accounts. But is just so he's working at Bear Stearns now? There is another person that's also very questionable. Another big question mark that we can put on there is Douglas Leese, who from what I understand, became a mentor to Epstein.
Yeah.
And for anyone that doesn't know, Douglas is a pretty infamous arms dealer.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and pretty well connected to the intelligence world. So that's where the question marks start to get bigger. Can you tell us more that relationship between Epstein and Douglas? Where did they meet? And does that seem questionable to you, or still no question marks yet in your mind?
Oh, well, that would come a few years later in the story. That would come once Epstein was really getting into the arms trade in the 1980s. And we can get there. Maybe if I just take it sequentially.
Yeah, please.
We're not far from the Douglas Leese part of this.
I thought I knew everything, and I have like 10 pages. Seems there's still a lot more that I don't know, which is insane. So I'll let you continue. We're at the Bronfman family.
Well, okay. So a major thing happens in this period. So Epstein is at Bear Stearns from effectively, the late 1970s up until 1981. 1980, 1981, he leaves Bear Stearns under sort of contested grounds. Some people say that he was fired. Some people say that he left on his own accord. But there appears to be some evidence that he got in some trouble at Bear Stearns over mismanaging or potentially having kind of fraudulent activity associated with what's called a Reg D filing. This is when you're doing a public offering. That's done through That's done through one method. If you're doing a private offering, that's done through something called Regulation D or Reg D. It's a fundraising essentially that has very specific technical requirements so that you don't need to comply with the onerous public offering ones, but it's easy to cut corners on that. And if you do, though, you're in trouble. And it appeared that he got in some sort of trouble with a Reg D filing and left, but then started at about 28 years old his own independent firm called Intercontinental Assets Group, IAG. And he billed himself as a bounty hunter for high net worth individuals and governments in order to hide assets or trace assets for high net worth individuals and governments. So, for example, I'll give you the example Ghislaine Maxwell just gave the Department of Justice a few weeks ago. When Todd Blanche from DOJ asked Ghislaine Maxwell to describe Epstein's business, she gave the example of El Chapo has a dispute with the Sinaloa drug cartel, and the Sinaloa drug cartel thinks that El Chapo is owed money by El Chapo, and El Chapo, however, has hidden assets in Cayman Islands bank accounts and offshore bank accounts, Swiss bank accounts, and they want to get the money from El Chapo, but they can't find it. They need a sort of technical forensic investigation of the money and then getting it back. And so the example that she gave was essentially someone like the Sinaloa cartel would reach out to Jeffrey Epstein, and Jeffrey Epstein would find El Chapo's money and work on getting it back for them. And he played the other side of the chessboard as well. If a client needed to hide money from creditors or governments, he would help structure that as well. Now, what's important is that Epstein reportedly remained a client of Bear Stearns even after he left. And so I don't believe for 1 second when we get to who Epstein was servicing with his IAG one-man shop in his own personal apartment in New York City. Let me say, can I curse? Or we don't need to. You don't know.
No, I curse. I curse all the time.
Okay. All right. Let me just say this. I worked with New York City major bankers my whole career from my mid-20s to mid-30s. Because the corporate lawyers and the investment bankers and that we're all together in one room, 3 out of 5 business days a week. You don't know fuck all about the technical structuring of the work at 28 years old, no matter how good you are. You could not handle, for example, Adnan Khashoggi's money as a 28-year-old kid. That is a fucking joke. Adnan Khashoggi was reportedly he told in 1987, he gave a public media report where he claimed that at his own one-man shop, Intercontinental Assets Group, one of his biggest clients was Adnan Khashoggi. Now, Adnan Khashoggi...
Epstein. So Epstein, IAG, IAG was Epstein's one-man shop, and he would manage the funds of others. And I think Adnan Khashoggi, which you'll tell us about, crazy story as well, was his only client at that time.
No, he claimed to have a whole range of clients, from folks in royal families in Europe and various governments. But Adnan Khashoggi
as a one-man shop. As a one-man shop.
Yes, as a one-man shop. And maybe I'll I was going to work up to this, but maybe I'll say this now. It's important to understand that he kept these relationships with Bear Stearns. And it would have been, you can very easily see where I am on this right now. And I think what makes it mentally easy to understand, and it doesn't mean it was structured exactly like this, but it would be very easy for a situation to arise as follows. Bear Stearns liked Epstein. He was a rainmaker. He was good at bringing clients in and keeping them happy, but he was bad at the actual technical work. And he was loose in terms of ethics and morals. And so he was a liability to keep on payroll. But Epstein could continue to be very useful to Bear Stearns if he simply went out on his own, managed those relationships, and then kicked the business to Bear Stearns. So instead of Jeffrey Epstein being a Bear Stearns employee, he would be a Bear Stearns client, and Bear Stearns would simply service the clients of Jeffrey Epstein that Epstein was managing. That way, if Epstein messed anything up or he didn't bring heat from the SEC, because the direct relationship was being managed through his outside shop. And so what's happening in this period, 1979 through 1981, is a massive change in the American intelligence apparatus. From 1976 to 1980, the CIA was completely gutted. The Church Committee hearings, the Pike Committee hearings, Stansfield Turner firing 30% of the entire CIA operations division, massive chains being put on what the CIA could and couldn't do. And there was not the massive NGO explosion structure in order to actually do this outside work until several years into the Reagan administration in the 1980s. And so there was a giant gold rush to try to create ways for CIA covert action to be done without it moving directly through the CIA or through using new and creative means to try to circumvent what was being done. Now, at that very moment, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, we talked about it in our last interview. That's when all these NGOs started coming up, the whole web of NGOs that started doing the dirty work for the intelligence. But by the way, as you continue, don't forget, I want to hear the Adnan Khashoggi story as well. So I'll let you plug it in when the right time comes up, because it is a crazy story.
Yes. Well, we'll get there right now. So in 1979, the several things happened that we are living in the aftermath of today. The reason many folks today look back at Jimmy Carter as a weak president and a total failure on foreign policy, in large part has to do because in 1979, Iran went through the Iranian Revolution, and essentially the Shah, the regime in Iran that had been installed by coup in 1953 by the Central Intelligence Agency and by British intelligence and statecraft folks after the attempted nationalization of British oil interests and the like. That government, which had lasted from 1953 to 1979, toppled, and toppled in a way that was very, very bad. It was seen for U.S. interests, British interests, Israeli interests, Saudi interests, and at that same time, the CIA was still under handcuffs, as you had Stansfield Turner and Jimmy Carter, and this commitment and this anger from Democrats at how the CIA had been weaponized and had done, assassinations and all sorts of unauthorized activity. And so basically the failure to have a strong CIA was blamed in significant part for losing Iran. Now, at that very time in 1979, Edgar Bronfman becomes the head of the World Jewish Congress. And in 1980, the Iran-Iraq War breaks out. And so while we did not like the new Iranian government, we did not want Saddam Hussein in Iraq to have regional hegemony. So you had this strange bedfellows alliance around the U.S., UK, Saudis, and Israelis to actually create to play kind of both sides of the Iran-Iraq war. Because while they wanted the Iran regime to topple, they did not want Iraq to sweep in and get all of Iran's oil and natural gas and resource wealth, which, if obtained, would completely destroy the economy of Saudi Arabia, which relies on regional dominance there.
So the US, so essentially, exactly. So Adnan Khashoggi, just simplify what you've just said. Iran, not an ally of the US after the revolution. Iraq, obviously not an ally of the US. Actually, it wasn't ally. The US was supporting Iraq, but they didn't want Iraq to get too powerful for whatever reason. I think there's different theories on this. So what the US started doing is they needed to covertly supply weapons not only to Iraq but also to Iran through Israel allegedly. And this is where the only way to do it is through arms dealers. And then this is where you link it. This whole crazy, the Iran-Contra story would link to Epstein, which is mental. And that's what you're going to tell us about now.
I think of it as the birthplace of his career. And I think that will be clear as we get deeper into it. But the Iran-Iraq war lasted from 1980 to 1988. This was almost the entire 1980s. And it's kind of one of these great forgotten wars of history because U.S. policy was so schizophrenic about it. And I think it's best captured by Henry Kissinger's quote when he said, "I only wish there was some way both sides could lose." So you had...
That's well said. That's very well said.
But coming into 1983, which is when things really started to escalate and Epstein was maturing in his Intercontinental Assets Group business, you had in place an arms embargo on Iran because of the 1979 revolution and arguments around human rights abuses. Iran, it was illegal to sell weapons to Iran under U.S. law, under essentially international agreements. But the problem was Iran was losing the war to Iraq at the time, who had twice as many troops. Remember, you had a very fledgling government in Iran. Iran did not really have a robust military. It was a paramilitary street movement that essentially toppled the government in 1979. And so the problem was by 1983, Iran was losing quite badly. And there was the perception that if we did not run arms to Iran, Saddam Hussein in Iraq would sweep the region and then essentially take that entire energy duopoly that was split between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And now it would be Iraq plus Iran, and they would effectively control all Middle East oil and gas. And so this was seen as an emergency that necessitated us finding some way to run arms to Iran so that they could stop Iraq from getting the oil and the gas and all the various mineral wealth. And Iran is a very abundant place. But the problem was that was illegal. So in 1983, a covert action was launched to try to do this without anyone knowing about it, so that they couldn't be prosecuted under international law, so that there wouldn't be a scandal. And this was done through an agreement between the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia. I'm sure there's a robust British connection. It's the records are murky on that because British secrecy being what it is. But the fact is the deal was for, at the time, the world's most prolific and profitable arms dealer, Adnan Khashoggi, who was a Saudi arms dealer who was described by Time magazine at the time as possibly the richest man in the world. In the 1980s, the argument was being publicly made that the richest man in the world was this obscure Saudi arms dealer. And just to give an understanding of how significant this figure was, in part because if Jeffrey Epstein is managing his money, and he has this much money, I think you don't do that at 28 years old, shall I say? You wouldn't trust a kid with that level of wealth. But so every year, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, BAE Systems, they hire commissions agents in order to try to broker deals on their behalf. They obviously have in-house capabilities, external stakeholder engagement, business development, but a lot of deal traffic comes through essentially lobbyists and brokers who have their own Rolodex of network connections. And when those people in the network need arms, these figures, these commission agents, will essentially propose, well, why don't you buy from Lockheed Martin? They have these tanks. Why don't you buy from Raytheon? They have these missiles. Now, Adnan Khashoggi made 4 times as much in commissions just from Lockheed Martin alone in the 1980s than every other commission agent combined. He was a one-man wrecking ball who effectively, there was not even a close second in the entire field of black market international arms dealings. Now, he was very close with the Saudi royal family, and he developed a very close kinship with both the U.S. and Israeli national security state. Now, he was the primary middleman. In 1983, he flies to Washington, D.C. to have a meeting with the head of the National Security Council at the time under Ronald Reagan, Robert McFarlane. Now, the National Security Council is the head of the interagency. So everything the CIA does, everything the Pentagon does, everything the State Department does has to be approved by the National Security Council, which is run by the National Security Advisor. This is why the National Security Advisor is such a powerful position. And so it's higher than the CIA. The CIA can't do something without the National Security Council sign off. And so Adnan Khashoggi flies to meet with the National Security Advisor, and Adnan Khashoggi proposes a relationship by which the U.S. will sell arms to Israel. Will sell arms through Adnan Khashoggi, and then Israel will essentially facilitate those arms moving to contacts in Iran. And this would go on to be called the Iran-Contra affair, because so we just covered the Iran part. The Contra refers to the Nicaraguan Contras. So in the early 1980s, the Democrats and Republicans had a big disagreement about foreign policy in Nicaragua. The sort of socialist Sandinista government was in power. The Reagan administration wanted to support a paramilitary insurgency movement called the Contras, But the problem is the Democrats still controlled the House of Representatives, and they passed an amendment called the Boland Amendment, which prohibited any U.S. development funds, so U.S. aid funds, State Department funds, military funds. Not one taxpayer dollar was allowed to be spent in any sort of support for the Contras. So the Republican executive branch wanted regime change through CIA covert action, but the Democrat legislative branch said you can't use CIA money to do it. You can't use State Department, DOD, and so they had to get creative if they wanted to do this by finding
And they
a
did
way
the same strategy as the Iran-Iraq
fiasco. The reason it gets the name the Iran-Contra affair is because what they did is when they sold the weapons to Adnan Khashoggi and when they sold the weapons to Iran effectively through the Saudis and the Israelis, they skimmed the profits from the weapons sales to divert them to the Contras. So they did two things. They were trying to be
stone.
right, but it was two illegal actions.
Mike, what I'm struggling to understand though is how the hell did Epstein get himself in this partnership? How did he get himself with Khashoggi, managing potentially one of the richest people in the world back then, managing his money? Or was he managing his money? What was his place in this web?
Well, the reason that I stress both the Iran and Contra side of this is because I'm trying to give sort of a gentle understanding to folks of the complex topic of international money laundering and the necessity of complex financial instruments and arrangements in order to disguise covert action so that it looks like above board money flows. So if you, for example, are running money to the Nicaraguan Contras, but that is illegal, or you're doing it on the basis of drug proceeds, because this is another part of Iran-Contra, because they couldn't get U.S. aid money, the CIA had to sell cocaine in order to fund it. The CIA famously is covered by Gary Webb and as effectively described in the John Kerry report in the 1980s when he was one of the senators investigating the CIA drug running affair there. And John Deutsch, the head of the CIA, had to do an apology tour in Compton, Los Angeles about this in the 1990s. But essentially, the CIA was using a proprietary CIA airline. So the CIA started something called Air America in the 1940s, 1950s. It was a CIA proprietary airliner so that when guns or drugs or cash or logistical supplies had to be moved from country to country or region to region, it could be done discreetly through the CIA's Air America. Air America had a spin-off branch, another CIA proprietary called Southern Air Transport, which was the primary airline used by the CIA in Nicaragua to run guns and drugs to the Nicaraguan Contras, because in Nicaragua they sat on a huge amount of the cocaine trade. And so what they essentially set up was guns for cash for drugs. I'm sorry, drugs for cash for guns, where the Nicaraguans would transport the cocaine under CIA auspices. It would be sold on the retail market. The proceeds would buy guns, and they'd send the guns back. And Southern Air Transport did both sides of that. They ran the drugs up from Nicaragua, and they ran the guns back down from the States to Nicaragua. Now, what's important about this is Southern Air Transport would then come to service Jeffrey Epstein's enterprise directly. In 1994, Southern Air Transport was in the heat of scrutiny of the Iran-Contra affair. Southern Air Transport shut down operations in Miami, Florida, where Jeffrey Epstein also lived for a very long time. And then it moved to Columbus, Ohio, to service what at the time was the country's largest retailer, the Limited Brands. Now, in 1991, Jeffrey Epstein got power of attorney over the entire corporate conglomerate of the Limited. It was a business enterprise where the ultimate authorized signatory was Jeffrey Epstein himself. the very CIA airline that was the central player in the Iran-Contra affair, where Jeffrey Epstein was handling the money for the CIA's most coveted asset in the whole operation, moved to directly service Jeffrey Epstein's conglomerate company. This is all been publicly reported in the Columbus local press and in various
You're
books.
talking about Leslie Wexner's empire?
This was Leslie Wexner's empire. This was Leslie Wexner. Wexner was the owner of Limited Brands, but he gave durable power of attorney to Jeffrey Epstein. Now,
Why?
So there's speculation as to why that is. Some people allege blackmail. Some people allege some sort of strange relationship. I actually think the best way to understand this, or at least I should say the Occam's razor for this, is that this is a technique that is sometimes used. It's less used today because many of the loopholes have been closed. But in the 1980s and 1990s, issuing somebody else durable power of attorney was a way to shield yourself from liability from illegal or shady contracts that your business dealings are a part of. So, for example, you can think of Intercontinental Assets Group as an extension of Bear Stearns in a similar way to me, as you can think of the durable power of attorney that Jeffrey Epstein held over the Limited as being an extension of Les Wexner's business enterprises. That is, it's a kind of plausible deniability arrangement.
Because no one could really give a proper explanation, or at least a theory for this. But this one makes sense. So you're saying Leslie Wexner, who was, I don't know how wealthy he was back then. I think he was a billionaire back then. Very wealthy man. And what everyone's trying to figure out is why he gave a power of attorney to Epstein. What you're saying is a way for him to shield himself from liability. But liability from what? Because he had Victoria's Secret as one of his companies under his various brands. What did he need to shield himself from, and how does that airlines come into this? So what I'm trying to understand is, like, how did Epstein, who's dealing with that biggest arms dealer back in the day, I'm not sure if he got involved with, I'm sure he got involved with intelligence back then when he's dealing with those Iran-Contra money laundering schemes. How did he get involved with Leslie Wexner? How does this fit into the whole scheme?
Yes, so understand the Limited was the largest retail conglomerate in the entire country at that time in the early 1990s. It was not just Victoria's Secret. It was dozens of apparel and Bath and Body Works and the likes. It was I think something like 30 different countries and companies at various times, and chain stores that all are massive logistical operations unto themselves. And because of that, they are also tightly involved in. They're the biggest logistic operations in terms of the amount of these big retail stores have to move a huge amount of freight, a huge amount of cargo in and out of ports, up and down roads and highways, in and out of railways in countries all over the world. And what was happening at the time, let me start with the simple side of the story, which is that Southern Air Transport formally said that they moved to Columbus, Ohio to service the Limited, and it would be a big local development for Columbus, Ohio, because of all of the business that this would bring in, and that they would essentially be they would move freight between Columbus, Ohio, and Taiwan. Hong Kong, I think, was actually the main route, which is its own rabbit hole side of the story. But let me put another thing forward here, which is the at that time. If you just give me 1 second, actually, I'm going to just make sure I get the name of this.
Yeah,
This company correct. Just give me 1 second. Yeah,
well,
here it is.
This is great. So, you found
out. So they inked the deal in 1994. Southern Air Transport moves to Columbus, Ohio in 1995. In 1995, the Limited purchases Galleon's Trading Company, which was a gun. It was a gun store. They were a hunt. It's hunting stores have a very interesting CIA history as being a way to run guns to groups. If you remember Operation Fast and Furious, when the CIA ran, well, I mean, technically it was the FBI and ATF, but it had interagency approval from the State Department, CIA, Pentagon. When the FBI and ATF directly worked with gun stores and sporting goods stores that sold guns to run this Fast and Furious operation to give no look arm, to basically have no registration check, no background check, no nothing, just basically give away guns so that they could be walked over the border to the Sinaloa drug cartel so that they could do war with the Los Zetas drug cartel, who was pilfering oil from ExxonMobil and Chevron and Texaco and all these Pemex partnered Houston oil companies. We couldn't go in and just bomb Mexico. So we needed to fund a military insurgency with one drug gang in order to stop the attacks on American interests in Mexico. Well, what's very interesting is, and I bring this up to sort of illustrate how it appears that Leslie Wexner's corporate interests seem to dovetail with various military and paramilitary activities. So in the very year that the CIA proprietary airline responsible for moving guns and drugs in Iran-Contra moves to service Leslie Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein, that's the very year that the Limited purchased Galleon's Trading Company with its assortment of gun retailers. In 1998, Southern Air Transport declares bankruptcy the very day that the CIA finally admits to the drug and gun running scandal from Iran-Contra after the 1997 Gary Webb book came out and the heat came on and they admitted Southern Air Transport's role, and then they closed down the airline. As soon as Southern Air Transport shut down in 1999, the Limited sells off its entire stake in Galleons. So it looks like the Limited basically bought a gun retailer only during the years that the CIA's gun movement airliner was directly servicing the company. And
so weapons smuggling, you think that power of attorney is just purely for him to use the empire to smuggle weapons? But why? Why would Wexner need to get into that industry, that dirty industry, and he's doing so well above board?
Well, markets are made by the military. Understand, ExxonMobil doesn't get its oil unless the military operation is successful. Walmart doesn't get its retail chains in the country unless the military effort is successful. Pizza Hut doesn't get to sell its pizzas in Russia unless the CIA and military effort during the Cold War is successful. But I keep coming back to this weapons and drug thing, for example. I mean, again, Ghislaine Maxwell is the one who brought the Sinaloa drug cartel, and these drugs are used in the process of, to fund these proxy wars as they were in Iran-Contra. But it's worth noting that this CIA proprietary airline that was moving drugs and guns, Southern Air Transport, when it moved to service Jeffrey Epstein and Leslie Wexner, they were parked at Rickenbacker Air Force Base. They were parked at a military base in Ohio, moving what was reportedly the Limited freight back and forth between Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is a narco island. Remember, it was seized by the British during the Opium Wars. The only reason Hong Kong was a British territory was because China refused to buy British opium. And so the British Navy swooped in, took over Hong Kong, and then forced China to buy its narcotics, and led the transport out of Hong Kong. But I have to just talk about the early 1980s and the military aspect of this, because again, you've got these strange bedfellows. You have U.S., UK, Saudi, and Israeli interests all working together in this giant military operation in Iran and Iraq. At that time, a man named Ehud Barak is the head of Amman, Israeli military intelligence. 1983 to 1985, Ehud Barak is and he was a he had been a military guy, cradle to grave, effectively. He had been the commander.
And then became prime minister of Israel, for anyone that doesn't know.
Yes. And then he became the prime minister of Israel and one of Epstein's very, very close business partners. They went in on Carbine 911 together. 100,000 new emails just leaked about this, where they're
this guy was connected to everybody. Everybody somehow was connected. Everybody was like just a few degrees of separation from Epstein.
Right. Well, but understand, Ehud Barak was at Jeffrey Epstein's house something like 45 times. He was. Again, there's 100,000 emails between him and Jeffrey Epstein, or 100,000 emails of his that just leaked, and I've seen dozens and dozens with him and Epstein in constant cahoots about recruiting people, business deals, geopolitics. It's like they had known each other forever, and they were financially tied to the hip together because of their mutual business investments. Now, at the very time that Jeffrey Epstein gets his start in managing the money for high-level arms dealers, or at least being the front end of that money management funnel, Ehud Barak is in charge of the biggest intelligence group in Israel. Now, everyone talks about Mossad. It's like a big meme. It's Mossad, but Mossad is not the biggest intelligence vector in Israel. Israel is effectively three intelligence brackets. They have Shin Bet, their version of the FBI, Mossad, their version of the CIA, and Amman, which is their version of the NSA. It's their version, but it's much more broad than that. It's their military intelligence. And it's, I think, 2.5 times the size of Mossad. It is a giant operation. And Ehud Barak, who would later come, we know that starting in the late 90s, early 2000s, he and Jeffrey Epstein would be very, very, very close. There's an open question, given that Jeffrey Epstein was servicing Adnan Khashoggi, who was working with Ehud Barak working with Amman, Israeli military intelligence, to move the weapons from Iran for the guy that Jeffrey Epstein was managing the money for. I mean, has anybody run the traps? I mean, think about this. Think about, for example, like the CIA station house in Tel Aviv or something. What records do they have from 1983 to 1985 about Ehud Barak and possibly even Jeffrey Epstein? I mean, think about the fact that perhaps the key figure in this, because Ehud, we'll get to the Ehud Barak thing hopefully if we have time later, because it goes very deep in that. But Ehud Barak was the guy in charge of Israeli military intelligence at the very moment that Jeffrey Epstein really started his career, a decade before the Leslie Wexner stuff, 2 decades before the Bill Clinton Global Initiative, Clinton Foundation stuff. This was when he was making the millions that he would later come to be known as a millionaire, billionaire type figure for. It was moving money through this exact network, through these exact foreign policy networks, these military networks, these financial networks. But it primarily, relied on this, I guess, U.S., U.K., Saudi, Israeli side, but an open question for Congress, an open question for our executive branch agencies like the DOJ and CIA and potentially DOD was there contact while, for example, Iran-Contra was running from 1983 to 1988 during that entire affair. There's going to be an unbelievable amount of records about Adnan Khashoggi. We already have a significant amount of that from disclosures from the 1980s, but not in a targeted way. But if you were to simply, did they know each other then? And if they did, for example, were they supporting Jeffrey Epstein then? Was there a CIA or Israeli military intelligence or Saudi intelligence relationship with Jeffrey Epstein in the 1980s, way before the stuff that came later? And can that explain what would then become his meteoric rise? It's worth noting that the FBI, when they raided his house in 2019, when he was arrested the second time, they found a fake passport that he had in his safe from 40 years earlier. It had his face, but a fake name. And he had 4 stamps on that passport showing that he successfully got in and out of 4 different countries on an illegal fake passport where his primary residence was listed as Saudi Arabia. Which was exactly where Adnan Khashoggi was, and where the US UK Israeli operation was based out of to facilitate the arms traffic. So how did he get such a good fake passport that he was able to go through, 4 different countries? One of them included the UK. Another one was, I think, Poland or Austria. And he was able to effectively, this thing was really good. He kept it in a locked safe. You and I can't just get a fake passport so good we can seamlessly move through, almost half a dozen countries without worrying about whether we're going to go to jail for 20 years or something like that.
So it's hard for this to function. It's hard for all these things to be true. And what you're stating are facts, like these things that have been confirmed, not allegations. It's hard for these to be true and not have some sort of intelligence connection, relationship, whether it's with US intelligence, Israeli intelligence, or Saudi intelligence. Is someone in this position, and let me know if you disagree, but someone in this position, there has to be some sort of relation with intelligence, considering that the whole Iran-Contra scheme was run by intelligence. And that's where it all started. This is where his intro into that world began, and it evolved, continues to evolve bigger and bigger until we got to where we are today. Is that a fair oversimplification?
Oh, I think it's extremely fair. The question, though, to me is not so much if, but how it was structured, because there are so many ways that something like this could be structured that I think to understand the range of possibilities is essential to being able to have investigation be efficient and accurate. And I'd like to kind of...
Could he be working with all 3 intelligence at the same time? Is that how it usually works? Because a lot of these intelligence organizations are rivals as well. Could they all have one asset that works with more than one? Could they trust the same person? Is that common?
Oh, absolutely. This is very common where you have shared... Now, oftentimes there's a junior and a senior partner. Sometimes that happens knowingly. Sometimes that happens not knowingly. But it's very common, for example, for someone to, if within, for example, the Five Eyes structure, or if you have in the context of a war where you have allied forces, for example, if you've got some joint military operation through NATO in Afghanistan, and you've got U.S. intelligence and French intelligence and British intelligence,
but even you look at Saudi and Israeli intelligence, that's where I wasn't sure. Allies, I understand, but Saudi and Israeli intelligence working together in those days?
Well, they were direct partners in Iran-Contra. On that particular thing, they were direct partners. Literally, it was a joint agreement between all of them. And sometimes, even though Saudi Arabia and Israel have had many, many differences and have gone through a very complex evolution of relationships, the U.S. often serves as a sort of mediator to for strategic action. The U.S. and Saudi intelligence states are effectively fused and have been for generations. It's and same with the U.S. and Israel in many respects. And even though there are, it's kind of there is a kind of Pythagorean theorem, I guess. Kind of what is it? A squared times B squared equals C. There is a kind of it all kind of works out to a lot of sharing, even if it's not direct or it's not permanent or it's on a tactical basis. We're not exchanging our long range plans, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We're both against Iran here, or we're both against Iraq here, in the context of this weapons deal, in the context of these financial arrangements, in the context of this logistical scheme. We, you know, we understand there are players in this who will speak to all of the different network relations. And okay,
I'll let you finish. I know Douglas Lee's in that same period as well, but we're not up to Robert Maxwell yet, are we?
No, that comes in, I think, 19...
We're not even, right. We're not even, I think it's 1991 is, I think, when he met Ghislaine, or Robert and then Ghislaine. But that is crazy. Like, this whole story for the past hour is before even Robert Maxwell. A lot of people know Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's father, who was likely ex-Mossad or Mossad asset or intelligence. I don't know if it was Mossad. All this was before Robert Maxwell. So it's like, it's unquestionable. Like, it's hard I understand people have conspiracies of what we have today when Epstein files, etc., but it is pretty much unquestionable that Epstein from early on was involved with the potentially more than one intelligence body.
Right. And again, there is, to me, the question is not if he had these intelligence relationships, but what was the role in terms of junior and senior partners. For example, I could see a world where he is primarily working with U.S. intelligence, but as a junior partner, he's working with Israeli intelligence and Saudis and British. I could see a world where he's primarily Israeli intelligence, but he's playing a junior role with, and it doesn't mean he is, because let me actually take a step back. I overstated that a little bit. The way this is structured, people who are the money side of covert action often have a much more independent relationship with intelligence, where you wouldn't say that they work for them necessarily. It's more like working with, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, because the lines get very blurry at that level of an operation. When you're talking about the financing and you're moving through bankers, you're moving through all these different brokers and bank managers and currencies and facilitators and front groups, that, because you're going to pull off something like disguising an illegal arms deal, you're going to have 30 different front companies. You're going to have all these different money laundering operations, which will all have their own little face for that shell. And it's not necessary that every link in the chain knows what's going on there or knows for certain. They may have an inkling, but they also know what questions not to ask if they want to make sure to get their money or be in the good graces, of the network that they're working with. And so I'll give you an example on this, because one of the things that is frustrating about the current state of play, about what we know, is that Vicky Ward from the Daily Beast reported that Jeffrey Epstein, that her source in the Trump transition team told her that Jeffrey Epstein told him, that Alex Acosta, the prosecutor who cut the sweetheart deal, said that he gave him the sweetheart deal because he was told to back off because Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone because it was above his pay grade. Now, if true, that's an absolute bombshell. But we don't have that corroborated. I believe Alex Acosta is set to testify soon, actually, to Congress, and I'm very enthusiastic about hearing what he has to say.
But do you really expect anything, considering how things are being covered up?
If questioners know what to ask, the problem is there are so many ways to screw up a deposition. And take, for example, what happened in November 2020. In November 2020, they tried to put this to bed, this Epstein intelligence story to bed. The Bill Barr, this is 2 weeks after Trump lost the election. So the Trump executive branch was very weak, but Bill Barr was still in charge of the Justice Department. And as their final kick in the pants, screw you to the Trump admin, at least that's how I read it, they finally released the report they had worked on for 21 months, from February 2019 to I guess November 2020. The Justice Department Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR, put together something like 350-page report reviewing Alex Acosta's plea deal and purporting to answer questions for the public about the questions that had generated the public outcry, including Epstein's intelligence links. Now, again, 21 months we're told they spent researching Epstein's intelligence links and the like. They only make one reference to it in the entire report. It's on page 169. It's footnote 244. Everyone can look this up. The November 2020 DOJ OPR report. One reference, page 169, footnote 244. And what it says is this. We asked Alex Acosta if he had knowledge that Jeffrey Epstein was an intelligence asset, and Acosta told us, quote, the answer is no. And that's what they used to put to bed. And there's so many things wrong with both the way that question was asked and the what it allows to give the public impression of without it necessarily being true, as well as the shadiness of the fact that if you ask me, Mario, did I brush my teeth today? I wouldn't say. I usually don't start by saying the answer is no. I would say no, but I might say the answer is no. If I said, well, I didn't brush my teeth, but I did gargle some mouthwash, does that count? And then we say, oh, well, no, no, that doesn't count. Or if you're not sure, then you should just say the answer is no. Okay, well, in that case, the answer is no. They didn't give the transcript. The DOJ did not give a transcript of what they asked and what was answered. It was just a one-line summary description. And they also asked whether or not he was a, quote, intelligence asset, which again is far too narrow a term, in my view, for what Epstein would have been, or where to look for it. Because an asset has a 201. An asset is within the kind of hierarchy of you've got agents and employees who are they have W-2s. They work for the agency as an employee. If you're an agent. You've got assets who are not formally employed. They're not going to get health insurance and and a pension, but they will get. Sometimes they're paid, sometimes they're not paid, but they do work for the agency or not necessarily. You can have unwitting assets. Essentially, it's a piece on the board that can be moved wittingly or unwittingly. But if they're doing so wittingly, they have what's called a human 201 file, human intelligence 201 file, where they're formally registered as an asset, and they have an asset. They've got a cryptonym. They've got they're in the system. They have a formal file.
So there's many ways to work with the intelligence, and if they're asking in a specific way, was he an asset? It's an easy way for him to say no, make it seem like he had nothing to do with the intelligence, but the answer could be correct. But Epstein could still be involved with intelligence, and that is your concern. We could see that again tomorrow. Hopefully we don't.
Most of the most important people who are functionally assets, but they're what they're referred to as facilitators or fixers or liaisons or friends of the station. And this is very, very common. In fact, in Iraq-gate, this happened with another Swiss banker, very close with Israeli intelligence, who was the main money mover for the Justice Department scandal in 1988, 89 over this. And he was the main money mover, and he did not have a human 201 file. I did a list of about 20 of history's most famous CIA money movers and facilitators or financial brokers. These are, the Rappaport types. 80% of them don't have human 201 files, but they are. The CIA has analyst memos on them. Their CIA name trace shows that they are. They've got emails, records, analysts' discussions about whether or not this person's trustworthy or they did this on this day, but they're not formally assets, even though they're working with, not for. Like Epstein might not have been reporting to the CIA. He might have only worked with the CIA, for example, when it was profitable for his Bear Stearns friends, or his Leslie Wexner friends, or his Ehud Barak friends, or his Adnan Khashoggi friends. And it's a take it or leave it relationship, but that still could have been a very critical one because it's moving around hundreds of millions of dollars. And if they can get Epstein's cooperation to get his donor network or to have his clients contribute to an operation or contribute to a network that's essential for an operation or to an industry, then that can be the difference between winning or losing. And so he could have been, indispensable. And this may explain why all of his various financial fraud activities, his entire career, appear to have been protected. Not only did he, was he a Bear Stearns guy and seemed to have been completely insulated from the Bear Stearns collapse, but the Doug Lessie story was because of Towers Financial. It was Doug Lessie that introduced Jeffrey Epstein reportedly to Steve Hoffenberger, the head of Towers Financial, which was the biggest Ponzi scheme collapse in the history of the country before the
Douglas
Bernie
Leslie
Madoff.
was the arms dealer.
Yes. And that was in the late 1980s when he moved from IAG to Towers Financial. This is the period in between his one-man high-level financial bounty hunter job and his Leslie Wexner and Maxwell era. He for about 2 years, 2.5, 3 years, he worked at Towers Financial during where the biggest Ponzi scheme, corporate Ponzi scheme at that time, I believe, of all time in the late 1980s, went down. The CEO, Steve Hoffenberger, went to jail for something like 15 years and claimed the whole time that Epstein was the main facilitator of it. It was in many ways Epstein's idea, but the Justice Department magically let Jeffrey Epstein off of all of the financial fraud that he was associated with and went by completely unblemished, just like it looked like he went unblemished for the Reg D work at Bear Stearns. He went unblemished for the potentially illegal arms deal activity with Iran-Contra, got off for the Towers Financial work, and appears to have gotten off with his U.S. Virgin Islands fraud activity.
Why?
Well,
Why do you think he got off?
If his Rolodex, his contacts, his donors and clients were essential to U.S. intelligence activity or military activity or the civil society side of that, then it is very, 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 very common for the Central Intelligence Agency to lean on the Justice Department to protect such individuals from prosecution. There's a dozen examples of this in the JFK files alone. You can look up the Rolando Masfer files, for example, when the Justice Department in the 1960s, for example. I'm only bringing this up because it was recently declassified in March. In the Justice Department arrested a CIA-backed Cuban mercenary named Rolando Masfer. At the time, the CIA was bringing over all these Cuban refugees and mercenaries working on various paramilitary plans to take back control over Cuba. And oftentimes these groups were involved in drug running, gun running, a lot of criminal activity, and were frequently getting in trouble with the law. And this created a lot of tension with the Kennedy administration, who was getting pressure within their own party about the overthrowing socialist governments and the sort of right-wing imperialism kind of questions that were playing out between the left and right at the time. And so Rolando Masfer had been essentially running a network of hundreds of Cuban mercenaries and planned an invasion of Haiti in order to use part of Haiti and ports in Haiti as a naval operations, a naval military base of operations against Cuba, essentially to create a way to autonomously wage, commercial and military, like naval blockades and attacks against Cuba. And the State Department learned of the plan and told Rolando Masfer, "Don't do this. You will be arrested if you attempt to do this." There was a neutrality act that you can be prosecuted under for going against this. But it appeared that the CIA supported the action anyway. This is part of the dispute, the tug of war of power in the JFK administration between the CIA and State Department. So he goes ahead and tries to do it. He gets arrested by Customs and Border Patrol agent who actually finds them at midnight trying to sneak onto the docks with hundreds of military men and guns. The Justice Department arrests him to try to make an example of him. The CIA then steps in and says, don't prosecute Rolando Masfer. They said, if you do so, there will be massive and irreparable damage to the CIA's paramilitary network inside of Miami. If Rolando Masfer is forced to testify, if any of his co-conspirators are forced to testify, it will reveal the size and extent of operations within Miami. It was not known at the time, but the Miami CIA station house was the largest CIA station in the world. Essentially, they protected him in order to. Now, what they ended up working out was a compromise where the CIA, the State Department ultimately won that. They agreed to a prosecution, but the Justice Department agreed to have a CIA counsel on their prosecution team and to submit motions and preclude the ability for defendants to bring up any line of questioning involving the CIA. And every time something was adjacent, they cited national security secrets to have the judge bar any lines of questioning that might. So basically, it was a softball trial. It was essentially a sweetheart deal situation. And there
that explains a lot how Jeffrey was able to get through all these different kind of.
But Bill Barr is the perfect encapsulation. Bill Barr was the lynch. He was the direct link between the CIA and the Justice Department his entire career. He went straight from the CIA to running the Justice Department under George H.W. Bush, and then gets back in charge of the Justice Department just in time for Jeffrey Epstein to do whatever he did to himself or was done to him in prison.
You're unsurprisingly, I've known you for years, unsurprisingly, you've gone deeper than anyone else I've heard on this issue so far. I think, so we're up to the 90s, early 90s now. I think what we need to do is, because I know we have an hour and a half today, which we've just reached, we'll do a part 2 on this. I think it's good to guide, because this story is going to go on for a while. It's good to guide people with the whole story of Epstein, of where it all started and how it got to where we are until his death and where we are today, even if the story continues, and allow people to connect the dots. I've been able to connect more dots in this discussion than all the other interviews and research I've done so far. So it was well said. We're still at the. And this is we're in the 80s. We've only done the 70s and 80s out of the story. So I think it's going to be probably a 3-part story before getting to the latest developments in the cover-up. So Mike, we've gone through 1973, starting with Donald Barr and the Dalton School, getting all the way to the Iran-Contra smuggling and Epstein kind of playing his role there. And the next step will probably be for the next discussion. We'll dig into how he met Wexner, Maxwell,
well,
and who Maxwell is. I think that's what the next step is. But Mike, absolute pleasure, man. It's a good discussion. It's honestly, man, every fucking time we talk, whether it's Brazil, whether it's the Twitter files, whether it's USAID, when you focus on an issue, you go fucking deep. It's insane.
Well, you're a great communicator on this, and thank you. You're killing it. Thanks for your leadership on all this stuff. And
I appreciate it, Mike. Thank you, bro.
We'll talk again soon. All right. Bye.
Thanks, man.